A group of tourists arrived in a famous European city, excited to explore its history and culture. They had heard stories about the grand palaces, the beautiful streets, and most of all, the famous royal guards who stood still no matter what. These guards were known for their discipline, standing like statues even when people tried to distract them. To many visitors, they seemed like something out of a storybook, tall, serious, and always in their neatly pressed uniforms. Among the tourists was a small group of friends who were always looking for fun. They were playful and enjoyed pranking each other, always laughing and joking around. But sometimes they took things too far. As they walked through the city, they spotted a royal guard standing at his post near a historic building. He stood tall, holding his weapon, his face calm and emotionless. He didn't move an inch, no matter how many people passed by. One of the friends nudged the others and whispered, "Let's have some fun with him." The others chuckled, already excited by the idea. They had seen videos online where people tried to make royal guards laugh or react, and they thought it would be funny to try it themselves. At first, they started small. One of them waved a hand in front of the guard's face, but he didn't blink. Another tried making silly faces, but the guard didn't flinch. A third person pretended to trip in front of him, falling dramatically to the ground, hoping the guard would show concern. But nothing worked. The guard remained completely still, his eyes focused straight ahead. The group laughed and felt challenged. "Wow, he's good," one of them said. "Let's see if he reacts to something bigger." Their excitement grew as they tried to push the joke further. One of them gently tapped the guard's shoulder, but there was no response. Another pretended to take his hat, but the guard stayed firm. The tourists found it amusing, but other people in the crowd were starting to feel uncomfortable. Some onlookers took out their phones and recorded the scene, sensing that things were getting out of hand. Then one of the tourists had a bold idea. "What if we tie him up? Just for fun. He won't stop us anyway." At first, the others hesitated, but then they laughed, thinking it was harmless. One of them pulled out a scarf, and they carefully started wrapping it around the guard's arms, pretending to tie him up. The guard, staying true to his training, did not react. He stood firm, even as they fastened the scarf tighter and added more ropes. Some people in the crowd gasped, realizing that the joke had gone too far. But before anyone could stop them, the tourists were already celebrating their prank. Little did they know, their actions had just triggered something they never expected. Within moments, an unseen force had already begun moving toward them, swift, silent, and unstoppable. The tourists laughed as they stepped back to admire their work. The royal guard now stood tied to the pole, his arms wrapped with scarves and ropes. It was all just a joke to them, something to show off later in photos and videos. They didn't think about how serious their actions really were. To them, it was just a bit of fun, a harmless prank to make their trip more memorable. People in the crowd had mixed reactions. Some chuckled awkwardly, unsure if they should laugh or be concerned. Others gasped, whispering to each other that this was going too far. A few people even took out their phones, recording the scene, knowing that something like this could easily become news. But through it all, the royal guard remained completely still. His face didn't show a single sign of emotion. His eyes stayed focused, just as he had been trained to do. One of the tourists waved a hand in front of the guard's face again. "Still nothing," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "This guy is really something." Another one laughed. "Maybe we should try making him talk next." They continued their jokes, completely unaware that trouble was already coming their way. They had no idea that the moment they touched the guard, they had made a huge mistake. The royal guards were not just ordinary people standing around for decoration. They were soldiers, trained to follow strict rules, and those rules included never allowing anyone to interfere with their duty. Unbeknownst to the pranksters, there were security cameras watching everything. Hidden eyes were observing from nearby posts. And most importantly, a silent alarm had already been triggered, somewhere just a short distance away. a group of highly trained guards was preparing to respond. Meanwhile, the tourists were still caught up in their own fun. One of them pulled out his phone and began recording. "All right, guys, this is the moment. We tied up a royal guard, and he didn't even blink," he said, laughing as he filmed. "This has to go viral." But as they laughed, something changed in the atmosphere. The crowd that had been watching started to step back. The whispers grew louder. People pointed towards something in the distance. The tourists were so caught up in their own game that they didn't notice the sudden change in energy. Then, a woman in the crowd muttered, "Oh no, they're coming." It was only then that the pranksters started to sense that something wasn't right. They followed the direction of the crowd's gaze and finally saw it. Down the street, moving with perfect precision, was a squad of royal guards. They marched in perfect unison, their polished boots hitting the ground with authority. They weren't running. They weren't shouting. But there was something about their presence that sent a wave of fear through the pranksters. The fun was over, and reality was about to hit them harder than they ever expected. The tourists' laughter faded as they saw the approaching squad of royal guards. Their once playful expressions turned into looks of confusion, then concern. The guards moved in perfect formation, their faces serious, their steps firm and disciplined. There was no hesitation in their movement. They were coming with a purpose. The tourists glanced at each other, unsure of what to do. Maybe we should untie him," one of them whispered, suddenly realizing that their little prank wasn't so harmless after all. Another tourist, the one who had recorded everything on his phone, gulped. "They don't look happy," he muttered. The crowd, which had been watching silently, slowly stepped back, making way for the squad. Some people had already stopped recording, sensing that this was no longer a moment for entertainment, but a serious situation unfolding before their eyes. Others whispered to one another, wondering what would happen next. The royal guards did not slow down. They did not speak. They did not break their formation. Their presence alone was enough to make the air feel heavy. The pranksters could feel their hearts pounding in their chests. The guard they had tied to the pole still hadn't moved or spoken a single word. His discipline remained unshaken, his face calm. But now he was no longer alone. His squad had arrived, and they were here to handle the situation. One of the pranksters, trying to act casual, chuckled nervously and reached forward. Okay, joke's over," he said, quickly untying the scarves and ropes. "See, no harm done." But it was too late. The squad reached them, stopping just a few feet away. The leader of the group, a tall, imposing guard with a commanding presence, stepped forward. His sharp eyes scanned the tourists, then the untied royal guard. His expression did not change. He did not have to raise his voice to make his authority clear. "You have interfered with a royal guard on duty," he stated firmly. His voice was steady, controlled, and left no room for argument. One of the pranksters forced a weak smile. "Oh, we were just having a bit of fun," he said, trying to downplay the situation. "No harm done, right?" The leader didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced at the guard who had been tied up. Though the guard hadn't spoken, there was an understanding between them. They were trained to communicate without words, to rely on discipline and protocol. A moment later, the leader turned back to the pranksters. "This is not a joke," he said. "You have disrespected a soldier on duty." The seriousness in his tone sent a chill through the group. They had expected maybe a warning, a few stern words before being sent on their way. But now, standing in front of these disciplined men, they realized they had made a grave mistake. The tourists' fun was over, and now they were about to face the consequences of their actions. The air grew tense as the squad of royal guards stood before the tourists. Their presence alone was enough to silence the entire crowd. The tourists, who had been laughing just moments ago, now felt a deep sense of regret. They had only wanted to have fun, to create a memory they could laugh about later, but now they realized they had crossed a serious line. One of them, still hoping to avoid trouble, nervously raised his hands. "Look, we didn't mean any harm," he said, his voice shaky. "It was just a joke. We untied him, so everything's fine now." "Right." The leader of the Royal Guards did not respond immediately. Instead, he glanced at his team, then at the guard who had been tied to the pole. The guard, still perfectly composed, gave a slight nod, just enough for the leader to understand that everything had been handled according to protocol. The crowd watched in silence. Some whispered among themselves, wondering what would happen next. Others shook their heads, recognizing the seriousness of the situation. This was no ordinary prank. The Royal Guards were not ordinary security officers. They were part of a long-standing tradition, trained to protect important places and people. Touching one of them, interfering with their duty, was not something taken lightly. Unbeknownst to the pranksters, the moment they had placed their hands on the guard, a silent alarm had been triggered. There were cameras in the area, watching everything, and hidden security officers had already been monitoring the situation. While the tourists had thought they were in control of their little joke, the truth was that they had been watched the entire time. The leader of the Royal Guards finally spoke again, his tone firm but controlled. "Interfering with a Royal Guard is a serious offense," he stated. His gaze was sharp, and his posture showed unwavering discipline. "This is not a game." One of the pranksters took a deep breath, realizing there was no way to talk themselves out of this. We didn't know," he stammered. "We just thought." "It is not about what you thought," the leader interrupted. "It is about what you did." A hush fell over the crowd. The reality of the situation had fully set in. The tourists had not only disrespected an official on duty, but had also made a mockery of a long-standing tradition. To them, it had been a harmless prank. To the Royal Guards, it was an insult to their duty and discipline. The pranksters exchanged nervous glances. Their fun had turned into something much more serious. The guards did not move, did not blink, but their presence alone made it clear. This was not something that would be ignored. Then, in the distance, more uniformed officers approached. But these were not Royal Guards. They were city police, and they were coming straight toward the group. The tourists' hearts pounded. They had thought they were playing a simple prank. Now, they realized they were about to face real consequences. The tourists stood frozen as they saw the city police approaching. Their earlier excitement had completely disappeared, replaced by a growing sense of fear. The Royal Guards had not moved an inch, standing firm in their disciplined formation. But now, things were about to take a different turn. One of the pranksters turned to his friends and whispered, "What do we do now?" His voice was shaking. Another one swallowed hard. "I don't know. Maybe just explain." But deep down, they all knew there was no easy way out of this. The police officers walked with purpose, their faces serious. They weren't running or yelling, but their steady approach was enough to make the pranksters feel cornered. The weight of what they had done was finally sinking in. The leader of the Royal Guards turned slightly and gave a short nod to the approaching officers, as if handing the situation over to them. The police wasted no time. A stern-looking officer stepped forward, his gaze sharp. "Who is responsible for this?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The pranksters hesitated, looking at one another, hoping someone else would speak first. Eventually, the one who had come up with the idea of tying the guard stepped forward reluctantly. It was just a joke," he muttered. The officer's expression did not change. "A joke," he repeated. He looked over at the Royal Guard who had been tied, then back at the tourists. "Do you understand what you've done?" One of the pranksters, still trying to ease the situation, forced a nervous smile. "We didn't mean any harm. We were just having some fun." The officer's gaze hardened. "This is not fun," he said. "This is interference with a military officer on duty. Do you realize how serious that is?" The crowd, still gathered around, whispered among themselves. Some shook their heads, while others watched with anticipation. A few had already stopped recording, realizing that this had turned into a real legal matter. The pranksters' faces turned pale. They had come here as tourists, thinking they were just enjoying themselves. Now they were standing in front of both the royal guards and law enforcement, facing the consequences of their actions. The officer continued, "Disrupting a royal guard is not only disrespectful, but it is also an offense. These guards are here to serve and protect, not to be treated as part of some game." The pranksters lowered their heads, finally understanding the gravity of their mistake. They had seen videos of people trying to make guards laugh or move, but they had taken things too far. What they had done wasn't harmless fun. It was a serious act of disrespect towards someone who was simply doing their job. The officer sighed, then signaled to his colleagues, "You will need to come with us." The tourists' hearts sank. They had never imagined that a simple prank would lead to this. But now, there was no escaping the consequences. Their trip, which had started with excitement and adventure, had suddenly taken a very different turn. This was no longer just an embarrassing moment in front of a crowd. This was real. They had crossed a line, and now they were facing the consequences. The tourists hesitated, looking at one another, hoping for some way out. But there was none. The police officers were waiting, their expressions firm. The royal guards remained in their disciplined stance, showing no sign of emotion. There was no arguing, no pleading. Slowly, the pranksters stepped forward, their heads lowered. The officer gestured for them to follow. And they did, their once cheerful energy completely gone. The crowd whispered as they watched the group being led away. Some had sympathy, while others shook their heads, believing the tourists had gotten exactly what they deserved. As they walked, one of the pranksters muttered, "I can't believe this is happening." Another sighed, rubbing his forehead. This was supposed to be fun, just a joke. The officer walking beside them glanced over. "A joke," he repeated. "You think interfering with a soldier on duty is a joke?" The prankster didn't know how to respond. He had thought it was harmless at the time. But now, after seeing the seriousness of the guards, the arrival of the police, and the reaction of the crowd, he realized it wasn't funny at all. The group was taken to a nearby police station. It wasn't a full arrest, but they were brought in for questioning. They were made to sit in a quiet room, where the reality of the situation fully hit them. One of the officers sat across from them. He placed his hands on the table and leaned forward slightly. "Do you understand why you're here?" The pranksters nodded slowly. "We do now," one of them admitted. The officer studied them for a moment before speaking. "The royal guards are not just standing there for decoration. They are highly trained soldiers. They have rules to follow, and one of those rules is to remain in position no matter what distractions come their way. You might have thought it was harmless, but what if this had been a real security threat? What if someone with bad intentions had done the same?" The room fell silent. The pranksters had never considered that before. To them, the guards had just seemed like statues, people standing still for tradition. But now, they saw it differently. These were real professionals, protecting an important place. After a long pause, one of them finally said, "We're sorry." The officer nodded. "It's good that you understand. But this is a serious matter. There will be consequences." The tourists exchanged nervous glances. They didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain. Their so-called fun had led them into a situation they would never forget. The room was silent as the tourists sat nervously, waiting for what would happen next. The reality of their mistake had fully set in. They weren't just in trouble. They had shown disrespect to something they didn't fully understand. The officer in charge looked at them carefully. "You may not have meant harm," he said, "but actions have consequences. You interfered with a soldier on duty. That is not a small matter." One of the pranksters, still feeling nervous, spoke up. "Are we going to be arrested?" His voice was quiet, filled with worry. The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, considering the situation. Under normal circumstances, you could face serious charges. You might not realize it, but what you did could be seen as an act of public disorder or even obstruction of duty. The tourists swallowed hard. None of them had ever been in trouble with the law before. They had come to this country as visitors, excited to explore. Now, instead of sightseeing, they were sitting in a police station, unsure of their fate. Another officer walked into the room and whispered something to the one in charge. He listened, then nodded before turning back to the group. "Luckily for you," he said, "the royal guard you interfered with has chosen not to press formal charges. He has reported that you did not physically harm him and that you untied him before we arrived." The tourists let out small sighs of relief, but the officer raised a hand. "That does not mean you are free to go just yet." Their relief quickly turned into tension again. "Because of the seriousness of this matter," the officer continued, "you will be given official warnings. This will go on record, and if you ever repeat this kind of behavior, the consequences will be much worse." One of the tourists nodded quickly. "We understand. We won't do anything like this again." The officer's expression remained firm. "In addition, you will have to pay a fine for public misconduct." The group looked at each other, realizing they had no choice. They had come on this trip expecting to spend money on souvenirs and fun experiences, not on fines for their behavior. But they knew they were lucky. This could have been much worse. One of the officers placed documents in front of them. "Sign these," he said, "to confirm that you understand your actions and accept the fine." One by one, the pranksters signed. Their hands were slightly shaky, not because of the fine itself, but because of the lesson they had learned. As they finished, the officer looked at them one last time. "Respect the rules of the places you visit," he said. "Not everything is a joke. Some traditions, some duties, should never be treated as entertainment." The tourists nodded. They had come to this country expecting adventure, but instead they had received a lesson they would never forget. And soon they would be walking out of that police station, carrying the weight of that lesson with them. The tourists stepped out of the police station, the cool air hitting their faces as they took deep breaths. It felt as if they had been holding their breath the entire time inside. The experience had shaken them. What started as a harmless joke had turned into something much bigger, something they never expected. No one spoke for a while as they walked down the street. The city was still lively, with people going about their day, completely unaware of what had just happened. But for the tourists, everything felt different now. The weight of their actions still lingered in their minds. One of them finally broke the silence. "I still can't believe that happened." Another sighed. "Yeah, we were really stupid." They all knew it was true. They had been careless, treating something serious like a game. Seeing the royal guard stand so still had made them curious, and instead of respecting the tradition, they had turned it into a joke. Now, they understood just how wrong that was. "We're lucky," one of them said. "The guard could have pressed charges. We could have been in real legal trouble." The others nodded in agreement. They had thought their prank would just get them some laughs, maybe a viral video. Instead, they had received a hard lesson in respecting other cultures and traditions. One of them looked at his phone and sighed. "The worst part is, we didn't even post the video. We were too busy panicking." There was a moment of silence. Then another tourist shook his head. "That's not the worst part. The worst part is realizing how disrespectful we were." The group walked past the area where the royal guards were stationed. This time, they didn't get close. They stood at a respectful distance, watching the guards in a new light. Before, they had only seen them as part of the scenery, as something amusing. Now they understood the dedication, the discipline, and the importance of their role. One of them spoke softly, almost to himself. "I wish we could apologize to him." Another nodded. "Me too." They knew, however, that the royal guards had their own code of conduct. The guard they had tied up had not reacted then, and he would not react now. His discipline had remained strong throughout everything. That, more than anything, showed them just how serious his duty was. As they walked away, one of them took a deep breath. "Let's just promise we'll never do anything like this again." The others agreed immediately. This was a mistake they would never repeat. Their trip would continue, but this experience would stay with them. They would go back home with stories to tell, but this one, this lesson, would be the most important of all. It wasn't about punishment or embarrassment. It was about learning respect. And that, they knew, was a lesson worth remembering for the rest of their lives.